They called Silas Vance a man with a ledger for a heart, cold enough to freeze the rain before it hit the dirt. So when the widow Clara, shivering on his porch, begged for a loan to keep her roof, the town held its breath for the slam of the door. Instead, Silas did the unthinkable. He handed over the cash and pressed a pristine white dress into her hands. The gossips whispered he had bought a bride, but they were wrong. That dress wasn't for a wedding. It was a confession. It was a ghost from the past, and the silence between them screamed of a secret that would soon change everything. Before we ride deeper into the story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. The winter of 1884 didn't just bring snow. It brought a silence so heavy it felt like a grave dropped on the chest of the valley. The wind howled through the canyons like a dying wolf, stripping the bark off the pines and driving the good folk of Oak Cabin deep into their cellars. But up on the lonely hill, the lights of the Vance Manor burned steady and cold. They said Silas Vance didn't feel the chill the way normal men did. That a man with a ledger for a heart and gold dust in his veins couldn't bleed like the rest of them. He was a ghost in his own town, a shadow who only emerged to collect debts or foreclose on the unfortunate with the mechanical indifference of a reaper. So when the widow Clara, wrapped in a thin gray shawl that had seen better decades, began that long, trembling walk up his frozen driveway, the few souls watching from the frosted saloon window quietly took off their hats. They were mourning her pride before it even died, certain they were witnessing a lamb offering itself to the slaughter. She stood on that imposing porch, shivering violently as the wind whipped her skirts, the wood creaking under her worn boots like dry bones snapping. She raised a small, red-knuckled fist to knock, hesitating, her breath hitching in the frozen air as if the cold had seized her very lungs. When the heavy oak door finally groaned open, it wasn't just a man who appeared, but a wall of darkness that seemed to swallow the meager porch light. Silas stood there, his eyes like flint. Clara's voice was a whisper against the wind, begging, pleading for enough to keep the bank from taking her roof for one more month. She waited for the slam, the cruel rejection that Silas was famous for, the sharp words that would send her back into the storm broken. The town held its breath, waiting for the inevitable cruelty. But the slam never came. Instead, Silas stepped back, the warm firelight from the hallway suddenly cutting across his face in a sharp transition, revealing not a sneer, but a strange, haunted hollowness that no one in Oak Haven had ever seen. He vanished into the gloom without a word, and returned a moment later with a heavy stack of bills. He didn't ask for interest. He simply pressed the money into her frozen palms, followed by something that made the saloon watchers gasp in disbelief: a bundle of white silk, spilling over her arms like liquid moonlight, a dress, pristine, lace-trimmed, and utterly out of place in a winter of gray wool and mud. "Take it," he rasped, his voice sounding unused and rusty, "and don't come back." The pain in his eyes wasn't the annoyance of a miser parting with coin. It was the agony of a man looking at a ghost. He shut the door before she could speak, leaving Clara alone with a fortune in one hand and a mystery in the other. Unaware that the silk she held carried a weight far heavier than the gold, the journey back to the cabin felt less like a walk and more like a battle against the very earth itself. With the snow piling high against the hem of Clara's skirt and the wind screaming in her ears like a chorus of restless spirits, every step was a negotiation with the frost. Her boots crunching through the ice crust that had formed over the mud, her breath pluming before her in ragged clouds that were snatched away by the gale before they could fully form. When she finally pushed through the warped wooden door of her home, the silence that greeted her was not comforting. It was heavy, thick with the stale air of a space that had been holding its breath while she was gone. She leaned back against the door, latching it with trembling fingers, her chest heaving as the warmth of the small, dying fire in the hearth washed over her frozen cheeks. It wasn't much, just a few embers pulsing with a dull orange glow, but it was hers. Saved by the stack of currency now burning a hole in her pocket, she moved to the hearth, her movements stiff and mechanical, feeding the last of her dry wood to the flames until they roared back to life, casting long, dancing shadows against the rough-hewn logs of the walls. Only then, when the fire was crackling with a steady rhythm, did she turn her attention to the bundle Silas Vance had pressed into her arms. It lay on the table where she had dropped it, wrapped in brown butcher paper that was slick with melted snow. It looked innocuous enough, a package that could have held flour or sugar. But Clara knew better. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs as she reached out, her fingers brushing the damp paper. Why? The question echoed in the empty room, bouncing off the rafters. Why a dress? And why look at her with eyes full of such raw, unbridled ruin when he gave it? She peeled back the paper, and the breath left her body in a sharp rush. The firelight caught the fabric and seemed to get lost in it. A pristine, shimmering white silk that looked like it had been spawned from the very clouds that hung over the mountains. It spilled out onto the rough wood of the table like water, pooling in folds of impossible luxury. This was not a garment made in Oak Haven, nor was it something a rancher's wife would ever wear to scrub floors or feed chickens. The lace at the collar was delicate, intricate, a spiderweb of thread that whispered of money, of cities, of a life Clara had only ever read about in tattered books. She touched it, her skin rough and chapped against the impossible smoothness, feeling a sudden, sharp pang of shame. It was too beautiful. It made the cabin look smaller, darker, dirtier. It was a ghost of a world she didn't belong to. She lifted the bodice, holding it up against her own woolen dress, the white silk glowing in the dim light. It was small, slender, cut for a woman who had never known the weight of a feed sack. And then, as she turned the garment in her hands, the firelight illuminated the inner hem. There, stitched in thread the color of dried blood, was a name, Emily. The letters were uneven, slightly jagged, as if summed by a hand that was shaking, or perhaps by someone who was weeping while they worked. Clara traced the letters with her thumb, a cold shiver running down her spine that had nothing to do with the draft under the door. Emily, who was she? A lover? A wife who ran away? The town gossips had never mentioned an Emily. They said Silas had come to the territory alone, a man without a past, springing from the earth fully formed with a heart of stone. But this dress, this fragile, ghostly thing, screamed of a past so vibrant and painful it had been locked away in the dark. The silence of the cabin seemed to deepen, the name staring back at her like an accusation. He hadn't just given her money. He had given her a piece of his soul, and she had no idea why. While Clara stood frozen in the flickering light of her hearth, miles away in the heart of the town, the atmosphere was decidedly different. The Oak Haven Bank was a fortress of brick and polished mahogany, a place where the air smelled of cigar smoke, ink, and the metallic tang of greed. Mr. Thorne sat behind his massive desk, a man who wore his suits like armor and his smile like a weapon. He was counting, always counting, his fingers moving deftly over the ledgers that mapped out the ownership of the entire valley. To Thorne, the land wasn't soil and grass, it was leverage. And Clara's land, that scrap of rocky earth at the edge of the creek, was the most valuable leverage of all. It wasn't the soil he wanted, it was the water. The creek that ran through her property was the key to irrigating the lower valley, a project that would make him a king in a land of paupers. He had done the math. He had calculated the days until their loan defaulted. He had the eviction notice already drafted, sitting in the drawer to his right, waiting for the sun to rise on the first of the month. The door to his office creaked open, and his clerk, a nervous young man with ink-stained fingers, slipped in. Thorne didn't look up. "Is it done?" he asked, his voice smooth and low, lacking the jagged edge of Silas's stone but carrying a far more dangerous weight. "Did the widow vacate?" The clerk swallowed hard, the sound audible in the quiet room. "No, sir," the young man stammered. Thorne paused, his pen hovering over the page. "No?" He turned, his eyes narrowing behind his wire-rimmed spectacles. "She has no money, boy. She has no cattle to sell. If she hasn't vacated, she is trespassing. The clerk took a step back, wringing his hands. She paid. Mr. Thorne. She came in an hour ago, paid the full balance, plus interest. The silence that followed was absolute. Thorne set the pen down, slowly, deliberately, lining it up perfectly with the edge of the blotter. Paid? He repeated. The word tasted like cash in his mouth. With what? The clerk hesitated. Cash, sir. Vance's cash. I recognize the bill straps. They were the ones we issued to Silas Vance last week. Thorne's face didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Silas Vance, the miser, the man who would sooner skin a flea for the hide than lend $1 to a dying man. Silas Vance had paid the widow's debt. Thorne stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the muddy street. He watched the snow falling, his mind racing, recalculating, reevaluating the variables of his equation. He had accounted for Clara's poverty. He had accounted for the harsh winter. He had not accounted for a miracle, or, perhaps, a betrayal. Silas knew the plan. Silas knew the value of that water. For him to step in, to throw away good money on a hopeless cause, it didn't make sense, unless Thorne's reflection in the glass twisted into something ugly, unless Silas Vance had gone soft, or unless he was hiding something. Thorne turned back to the room, his eyes hard and bright. Get my coat, he ordered, his voice clipping the air. And bring the file in, Vance. The old file, the one from before the war. The clerk scrambled to obey, but Thorne was already moving, pacing the length of the rug. He didn't care about the few $100s of interest. He cared about the water, and if Silas Vance was going to stand between him and his ambition, then Silas Vance would have to be broken. Thorne didn't know about the dress. He didn't know about Emily, but he knew about weakness, and he had just smelt blood in the water. The firelight in Clara's cabin might have been illuminating a mystery of love and loss, but the lamp on Thorne's desk was illuminating a map of war. The lines were drawn. The widow had her reprieve, but the banker had his target. And in the Wild West, a man with a ledger and a grudge was far more dangerous than a man with a gun. The ghost in the silk was one thing, but the monster in the bank was quite another. And both were now awake. The news of the transaction moved through Oakhaven faster than the influenza had the wind prior, jumping from the general store to the blacksmith's forge and finally settling, thick and suffocating, in the haze of the Golden Steer Saloon. It was a Tuesday night, usually a quiet affair reserved for the serious drinkers who preferred to drown their sorrows in silence. But tonight the air was electric with the hum of speculation. The saloon didn't roar. It whispered. 1,000 tiny cuts of gossip that were far more damaging than a shout. Men leaned over the scarred mahogany tables. Clutching glasses of amber liquid, they caught the dim lantern light, their eyes darting toward the frosted windows every time the wind rattled the panes. They weren't talking about the weather or the price of cattle. They were talking about the impossible. $500, a voice hissed from the corner, belonging to a miner with coal dust permanently etched into his knuckles. Cold hard cash, handed it over like it was nothing. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the room, followed by sharp, cynical laugh from the bar. And the dress, another voice cut in, deeper, laced with the venom of a man who had never known charity. Don't forget the dress, white silk, imported, the kind a man buys when he expects a return on his investment. The insinuation hung in the stale air like smoke. The town couldn't process kindness from a man like Silas Vance, so they processed it as corruption instead. To them, the ledger had to balance. If Silas gave money, he was buying something. If he gave a dress, he was buying a person. He bought her, the bartender muttered, wiping a rag in endless circles over a stain on the wood. Plain and simple, the widow was desperate, and Vance saw a bargain. He didn't pay a debt. He paid a dowry. The crude logic settled over the room, satisfying their need to understand the world through the lens of greed. They were betting on it now, slapping coins onto the sticky tables. wagering on when the wedding would be, or if there would be a wedding at all before Silas moved her into that cold manor on the hill. The door swung open with a groan that silenced the room instantly. The wind swirled in, carrying a flurry of snow and the tall, grim figure of Silas Vance himself. He stepped out of the night and into the yellow light, stomping the snow from his boots with deliberate, heavy thuds. He didn't look at the men. He didn't look at the bartender. He moved to the counter with his head down, the brim of his hat shading his eyes. He placed a single coin on the wood and asked for a bottle of liniment, his voice rough and quiet. The silence behind him was deafening. It was a physical weight, pressing against his spine. He knew what they were saying. He could feel their eyes boring into the back of his coat, peeling away the layers of wool to judge the man beneath. "Nice night for a visit, ain't it, Silas?" Someone called out, the voice dripping with false cheer. Silas didn't turn. His hand tightened around the bottle of liniment until his knuckles turned white. "Here you're expanding your assets," another voice jeered, emboldened by the first. "Getting yourself some livestock that walks on two legs?" The room erupted in low, cruel chuckles. This was the moment. This was the moment a normal man would spin around, throw a punch, scream the truth that the dress was a shroud for a memory, not a gown for a bride. But Silas Vance was not a normal man. He was a vault. The internal dilemma raged behind his stoic mask, a fire of indignation that wanted to burn the saloon to the ground, but he suffocated it. To explain was to reveal the wound. To defend Clara's honor was to admit he had a heart capable of caring, and that was a weakness he could not afford. He picked up the bottle, his jaw set so hard a muscle feathered in his cheek, and walked back toward the door. "She's too young for you, Vance," the miner shouted as the latch clicked. "You'll freeze her to death up there." Silas stepped out into the cold, the laughter cut off by the slamming door, but the words followed him, echoing in the hollow chambers of his chest. He didn't go home. He couldn't. The manor was too quiet, and the accusations were too loud in his mind. Instead, he turned his collar up against the biting wind and walked past the livery, past the sleeping church, to the iron gates of the cemetery. The snow was deeper here, undisturbed, a pristine blanket over the sleeping dead. He walked the path he had memorized 20 years ago, his boots sinking into the drifts, until he stopped at the far edge of the yard, away from the marble angels and granite obelisks of the respectable families. He stood before a small, sunken patch of earth marked only by a piece of weather-beaten oak. There was no name carved into the wood. There never had been. He had been too poor to afford a stone when she died, and too ashamed to add one later when he became rich. Who had a stone would be to admit he had the money now that could have saved her then. It was a paradox of grief that kept the grave unmarked. "They think I bought a wife," he whispered to the wind, his voice cracking in a way it never did in the bank. "They think the dress is for a wedding." He looked down at the snow, imagining the small body lying 6 feet beneath it. The fever that had taken her, the few dollars he had hoarded instead of paying the doctor because he thought she was strong enough to survive the winter. She hadn't been. He had saved the money and lost the world. The white dress he had given Clara, the one causing such scandal in the saloon, was the dress he had bought the day after the funeral, in a delirium of grief, imagining he could still dress her for the burial. But he couldn't bring himself to put it on her cold body. It was too fine, too late. So he had kept it in a trunk, folded in tissue paper, a ghost in silk. Giving it to Clara wasn't a purchase, it was an exorcism. But the town would never know that. They only saw the miser, not the father. Silas reached out, his gloved hand brushing the snow off the top of the rotting wooden marker. The cold seeped through the leather, biting his skin, but he didn't pull away. He stood there in the dark, a man accused of a sin of lust while he drowned in a sin of neglect. The silence of the graveyard offering the only company that didn't judge him. Only because the dead already knew the truth. The library of the Vance matter was not built for comfort. It was built for containment. The walls were lined with books that had never been opened, their spines stiff and uncracked, standing like silent sentinels guarding the history of the man who had no wish to be remembered. The only light came from a single oil lamp on the massive oak desk, casting a pool of yellow illumination that barely held back the encroaching shadows of the room. Silas sat within the circle of light, his ledger open, but his pen hovered motionless over the page. For the first time in 20 years, the numbers didn't make sense. The columns of profit and loss, usually so comforting in their absolute certainty, now seemed trivial compared to the image burned into his mind. Clara's face in the moonlight, the shock, the confusion, the white silk spilling from her hands. He was staring at his euro in the expense column, the debt he had erased, when the heavy brass knocker on the front door echoed through the empty house like a gunshot. It was late, far too late for honest business, and the storm outside was raging with a renewed vengeance. Silas didn't move to answer it, letting the housekeeper, an elderly woman as silent as the house itself, shuffle down the hall. Moments later, the library doors creaked open, and Mr. Thorne stepped in. The banker brought the cold with him, a gust of freezing air clinging to his expensive wool coat. He didn't wait for an invitation. He peeled off his gloves with the slow, deliberate movements of a surgeon preparing to operate, his eyes scanning the room with a mixture of disdain and calculation. "A dirty place, Silas," Thorne remarked, his voice smooth and oily, sliding over the silence without breaking it. "But then, gold doesn't require sunlight to shine, does it?" Silas didn't rise. He simply closed the ledger, the sound of the heavy cover hitting the desk serving as his only greeting. "What do you want, Thorne?" he rasped, his hand moving instinctively to the drawer where he kept his revolver. Though he left it closed, Thorne smiled, a thin, humorless stretching of lips that didn't reach his eyes. He pulled a chair opposite the desk and sat, placing a leather satchel on his lap. "I've come to save you from a mistake," Thorne said softly. "My clerk tells me you settled the widow Clara's account, paid it in full, including the penalties." Silas stared at him, his face a mask of granite. "It's my money," Silas grunted. "I'll spend it how I please." Thorne chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Charity doesn't suit you, Silas. It fits you like a cheap suit. We both know you don't care about the widow. You care about leverage. So, I'm here to offer you a profit. I'll buy the note from you. I'll reimburse the cash you put down, plus 10%. You make a quick return. I get the land. Everyone wins." Silas looked at the banker, really looked at him, and saw a reflection of what he had been for 2 decades. A predator, a man who saw the world as a carcass to be picked clean. Thorne wanted the water rights. Silas knew that, if Thorne got the land, he would dam the creek, starve the downstream farms, and turn the valley into his personal kingdom. A week ago, Silas wouldn't have cared. He might have even helped him do it for a cut of their profits. But tonight, the thought of Thorne's polished boots walking over the floorboards where Clara had stood, the thought of him tearing down the roof that sheltered the white dress, sparked a sudden, unfamiliar heat in Silas's gut. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was revulsion. "No," Silas said. The word hung in the air, simple and absolute. Thorne blinked, his composure slipping for a fraction of a second. "Excuse me? The note isn't for sale," Silas clarified, his voice dropping an octave, becoming the low rumble of impending thunder. "The debt is paid. The land belongs to her. The matter is closed." Thorne sat back, his eyes narrowing. He hadn't expected this. He had expected greed. He had expected a negotiation. 20%, Thorne countered, his voice harder now. 30. "Name your price, Silas. Everything has a price. You of all people know that." Silas leaned forward, the lamplight carving deep shadows into the hollows of his face. "Not this," he said. "Get out of my house." The rejection was a physical blow. Thorne's face flushed, a mottled red creeping up his neck. He stood up, snatching his gloves from the desk. But he didn't leave. Instead, he walked to the fireplace, turning his back to the flames to face Silas. The mask of civility dropped completely, revealing the shark beneath. You think you've suddenly grown a conscience? Thorn spat, his voice tripping with venom. You? The butcher of Boreas Pass? The name hit Silas like a physical blow to the chest. The air left his lungs. The room seemed to tilt. Boreas Pass. It was a place that didn't exist on maps anymore. A mining camp that had been wiped out by a blizzard and a subsequent cholera outbreak in '64. It was a graveyard of ambition, and it was where Silas Vance had made his first fortune. He hadn't mined gold. He hadn't panned the rivers. When the pass got snowed in and the food ran out, Silas had been the one with the supply wagon. He had been the one who realized that starving men would sign over their claims, their deeds, their very lives, for a single sack of flour or a bottle of medicine. He had sat in a warm tent while men froze, trading blankets for gold dust, weighing the desperation of fathers against the purity of the ore. He had walked out of that pass the richest man in the territory, leaving a trail of shallow graves behind him. He had spent 20 years burying the truth under layers of respectability and intimidation. I don't know what you're talking about, Silas whispered, but his hand was trembling. Thorn saw it. He smiled, a cruel, victorious grin. Oh, I think you do, Thorn purred, stepping closer, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the floor. I have a friend in the territorial archives. We found the old manifest logs. Vance provisions. You didn't make your money on cattle, Silas. You made it on misery. You made it on the blood of men who trusted you to help them. Thorn leaned over the desk, his face inches from Silas's. Now, imagine if the widow knew that the money that saved her farm came from the same man who might have squeezed the life out of her father's generation. Imagine if the town knew that their illustrious banker is nothing but a vulture who grew fat on the dead. The silence that followed was screaming. It was the sound of a carefully constructed life fracturing down the middle. Silas couldn't breathe. The ghost of Emily, the ghost of the white dress, and now the ghosts of Boreas Pass were all crowding into the room, suffocating him. You wanted to play the hero, Silas? Thorn hissed, straightening up and buttoning his coat. Fine. Keep the note. But remember, heroes have to be pure. And you're rotten to the core. I'll give you a week to reconsider the sale. If you don't, the whole town will know exactly where your gold came from. Thorn turned on his heel and walked out, the door clicking shut with a finality that echoed like a judge's gavel. Silas remained in the chair, the lamplight flickering as the oil ran low, staring into the darkness where the demons of his past were finally, after 20 years, beginning to take shape. He had saved Clara from the bank, but he had handed Thorn the shovel to dig his own grave. The ledger was open, and the past was coming to collect. Sunday morning in Oak Haven arrived not with the gentle grace of the Sabbath, but with the sharp, scrutinizing glare of a courtroom. The storm had broken, leaving the sky a bruised purple that slowly bled into a pale, unforgiving blue, and the sun reflected off the snow with a brightness that exposed every crack in the sidewalk and every stain on a man's coat. The bells of the First Methodist Church rang out, clanging against the frozen air like a hammer striking iron, calling the righteous and the sinners alike together. For most, the church social was a time of community, of potlucks and hymns sung slightly off-key. But for Silas Vance, it was a weekly penance he endured with the stoic silence of a statue. He sat in the back pew, his black coat buttoned to his chin, his hat resting on his knee like a shield. He stared straight ahead, past the altar, past the cross, his eyes fixed on a stain in the wood of the pew in front of him. He was trying to keep his mind empty, trying to block out the whispers that drifted from the front rows like a draft. The town was still chewing on the bone of the scandal, the money, the dress, the rumors of a bot cried. Silas could feel their eyes darting back toward him, judging, calculating, dissecting his morality while they sang of forgiveness. He tightened his grip on his hat, his knuckles white. He just had to get through the hour. He just had to endure the sermon, leave his offering, and retreat back to the silence of his hill. But fate, it seemed, was not done balancing the ledger. The heavy double doors at the back of the sanctuary creaked open, groaning against the rusted hinges, and a sudden draft of winter air swirled into the warm, candle-lit room, causing the flames to flicker and dance wildly. Heads turned, the hymn faltered, the voices dying out one by one until the only sound was the wind whistling through the gap in the doors. And then, she stepped in. Clara stood framed in the doorway, silhouetted against the blinding white snow outside. She was not the shivering, broken creature who had begged on the porch. She was not the widow drowning in debt. She was a vision that defied the gray wool and drab cotton of the congregation. She wore the white dress, but she had changed it. She had sat up through the long, lonely night, her fingers working by the light of the fire, altering the silk with a desperate kind of dignity. She had removed the excessive lace that screamed of a wedding. She had hemmed the train that was meant for an aisle she would never walk, and she had wrapped a simple black shawl over her shoulders, grounding the ethereal light of the fabric with the darkness of her mourning. She didn't look like a bride. She looked like an angel of vengeance, or perhaps an angel of mercy, returning to a world that didn't deserve her. The silence in the church was absolute. It was a vacuum that sucked the air out of the room. The women stared with mouths slightly agape, unable to reconcile the poverty of the widow with the queenly grace of the woman standing before them. The men stared with a mix of awe and shame, realizing that the gossip in the saloon had been cheap and small compared to the reality of her presence. Clara lifted her chin, her eyes scanning the room, finding the courage that comes only when a person has nothing left to lose. She began to walk down the center aisle, the rustle of the silk whispering through the silence like a secret being told. She wasn't walking toward the altar. She was walking toward a seat. But to Silas, she was walking straight through the walls of his fortress. Silas Vance had been staring at the floor, but the silence made him look up. And when he did, the world stopped. The church vanished. The congregation dissolved into mist. The smell of beeswax and stale incense was replaced instantly by the smell of wood smoke, rubbing alcohol, and the metallic tang of fever. The slow zoom of his memory pulled him out of the present and hurled him violently back 20 years, to a night he had spent 2 decades running from. He wasn't in the two anymore. He was standing in the doorway of a small, freezing cabin in Boreas Pass. The wind was howling outside, identical to the wind that had just blown past Clara. In the corner of the room, on a pallet of straw and blankets, lay a small form, Emily, his daughter. She was burning up, her skin radiant and terrifyingly pale against the dark wood. He could hear her breathing, a shallow, rattling rasp that sounded like dry leaves dragging on stone. He could feel the weight of the gold dust in his pocket, the profits from the supply wagon, the money he had squeezed from dying men. The doctor stood beside him, a man with tired eyes and a frayed coat. "The medicine is expensive, Vance," the doctor was saying, his voice echoing in the cavern of Silas's memory. "And the treatment? It requires care I can't give for free." Silas heard his own voice answer, a voice from the past that he wanted to strangle. "She's strong," the younger Silas had said, clutching the gold. "It's just a fever. It will break. I won't pay robbery prices for a bottle of snake oil." The door slammed. The doctor left, and the fever didn't break. It burned. It burned until the rattling stopped. It burned until the silence in the cabin was louder than the storm. And then, the memory shifted, jarring and abrupt. He was in the city, days later, driven by a madness of grief and guilt. He was in a shop that smelled of lavender and money. He was buying a dress, a white dress, silk, lace, the finest thing the territory had ever seen. He was buying it for a girl who would never wear it, buying it to dress a corpse because he couldn't bear to bury her in the rags of his own greed. He held the dress in the memory, weeping over the silk, but he never put it on her. He couldn't. He had locked it away, just as he had locked away his heart. The vision shattered. Silas gasped, a loud, wet sound that tore through the hush of the church. He was back in the pew, but Clara was closer now, passing the row where he sat. The light from the stained glass window caught the silk of her dress, turning it a blinding, radiant white. It was the same white. It was the same silk. It was Emily walking toward him. Grown, accusing, forgiving, alive and dead all at once. The physical sensation hit him like a fist to the gut, nausea, vertigo, a cold sweat that instantly soaked his collar. The room spun. The faces of the townspeople distorted into grotesque masks. He couldn't breathe. The walls were closing in, the hymn book rack in front of him blurring. He saw Clara look at him, her eyes wide with confusion, seeing the color drain from his face until he looked like a corpse himself. He couldn't explain. He couldn't speak. He scrambled to his feet, his boots slipping on the floorboards, knocking the hymnal to the ground with a loud clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet church. "Mr. Vance?" Someone whispered. Silas didn't answer. He stumbled into the aisle, blindly pushing past the end of the pew. He had to get out. He had to get away from the white dress. He had to get away from the ghost. He practically ran toward the doors, his breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. He burst out into the cold air, the brightness of the sun searing his eyes, and collapsed against the rough brick of the church exterior, clutching his chest as if his heart were trying to claw its way out. Inside, the congregation murmured, the sound rising like a swarm of bees. They thought he was ashamed. They thought he was fleeing the scandal of the woman he had bought. They didn't know he was fleeing the judgment of a child who had died because he loved his ledger more than her life. Inside the church, Clara stood frozen, her hand resting on the back of a pew, the white silk trembling with the force of her own heartbeat, watching the empty doorway where the strongest man in Oakhaven had just broken. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then, let's get back on the trail. The sky had turned the color of a bruised plum by the time Clara reached the Vance homestead, the crisp white snow of the morning dissolving into a gray, weeping slush under the relentless assault of a freezing rain. It was a weather that matched the turmoil in her chest, a cold, soaking downpour that plastered the black shawl to her shoulders and weighted down the hem of the white silk dress until it dragged in the mud like a heavy chain. She hadn't gone home. She couldn't. The image of Silas Vance, a man carved from granite and ice, crumbling before the altar was burned into her mind, and the name Emily stitched into the hem of the dress burned against her skin like a brand. She found him exactly where she expected, not inside the fortress of his manor, but standing on the edge of the porch, unprotected, letting the icy rain lash against his face as if he were trying to wash away the very skin that held him together. He didn't turn when he heard her horse approach, nor when her boots hit the wooden steps with a wet, heavy thud. He just stared out at the valley, his eyes fixed on nothing, his hands gripping the railing so hard the knuckles were skeletal white. Clara stopped a few feet behind him, shivering not just from the cold, but from the terrifying intimacy of the moment. The silence between them was louder than the thunder rolling in the distance. "Who is she?" Clara asked, her voice trembling but clear, cutting through the sound of the falling rain. Silas flinched, a microscopic movement that rippled through his rigid frame. He didn't answer immediately. He took a breath that shuddered in his chest, a sound like a dying engine trying to turn over one last time. "She would have been your age," he finally whispered, his voice a rough gravel that seemed to scrape its way out of his throat. "Maybe a little older. She had hair like corn silk, and eyes that looked at you like she knew every secret you ever tried to hide." He turned slowly, and Clara gasped. The man before her wasn't the banker. He wasn't the miser. He was a ruin. His face was wet with rain and tears, indistinguishable from one another, flowing into the deep lines etched by years of bitterness. Emily wasn't a lover. Clara. She was my daughter. The confession hung in the damp hair, heavy and suffocating. Clara's hand flew to her mouth, but Silas pressed on, the dam finally breaking, the words spilling out on a torrent he could no longer hold back. 20 years ago, I didn't have this ranch. I didn't have the bank. I had a claim up in the high country in a cabin that let the wind in through the cracks. I had a wife who died birthing her, and I had Emily. That was it. That was my whole world. He looked down at his hands, large, rough hands that had counted so much gold and held so little love. I was obsessed. Clara. Obsessed with security. I thought money was the only wall that could keep the dark out. So I saved. I scraped. I starved us both to put another nugget in the tin under the floorboards. I told myself I was doing it for her, building a future where she'd never be cold again. He paused. A long, agonizing silence where the only sound was the rain drumming a funeral march on the porch roof. Then the fever came. It wasn't bad at first, just a flush, a cough, but it settled deep. She burned so hot I could feel the heat coming off her from across the room. Silas closed his eyes, squeezing them shut as if trying to block out a vision that was searing his retinas. The doctor. He was a drinker, but he knew his trade. He came up the mountain. He looked at her. He told me she needed quinine and a tincture he had to order from the city. He told me the price. Silas laughed then. A broken, jagged sound that had no mirth in it. $5. That's what he wanted. $5 and the cost of the medicine. I had $500 under the floor. $500 in gold dust. But I looked at him, and I saw a cheat. I saw a man trying to rob a poor miner. I told myself the fever would break. I told myself she was strong. I told myself. His voice cracked, fracturing into a sob that he strangled in his throat. I told him to get out. I told him I wouldn't pay for water and sugar. Clara took a step forward, her heart breaking for the monster standing before her. But he held up a hand to stop her. He needed to finish. He needed to bleed it all out. She died 2 nights later, he whispered, the words falling like stones. She woke up once, called for a water, and then she was gone. Just like that. The silence. Clara. The silence in that cabin was the loudest thing I've ever heard. It screamed at me. It told me I was a murderer. He gestured vaguely to the dress she was wearing, his eyes full of a tortured reverence. I went crazy. I think I lost my mind for a while. I took the din from the floor, the gold I had saved, and I went to town. I wanted to buy her back. I wanted to trade the gold for her breath. But you can't trade with death. So I went to the finest seamstress in the territory. I threw the money at her. I told her to make a dress for an angel. White silk, lace. I wanted to bury her in it. I wanted her to look like a princess in the ground so God would know she was precious. He looked at Clara, really looked at her, seeing the ghost of his daughter overlaid on the woman he had helped. I brought it back to the cabin. I washed her face. I brushed her hair. But when I went to put the dress on her, I couldn't do it. He shook his head slowly. I couldn't put something that beautiful on the body I had let die. It felt like a lush. It felt like I was trying to cover up my sin with silk. So I buried her in her nightgown, in the cold ground, with a wooden marker because I couldn't bear to carve her name in stone and see it last forever. The wind picked up, blowing the rain sideways, soaking them both to the bone. But neither moved. I kept the dress, Silas continued, his voice barely audible over the storm. I kept it in the trunk. Every time I made $1, every time I foreclosed on a farm, every time I turned a desperate man away, I opened that trunk and looked at it. It was my ledger, Clara. It was the balance I could never pay. It reminded me that no matter how much gold I stacked, I was still the man who sold his daughter's life for $5. He looked at the white fabric clinging to Clara's form, now stained with the mud of the rite in the suit of the church floor. When you came to my porch, shivering, begging, you had the same look in your eyes that she did that last night. The fear, the hope, and I knew, if I sent you away, if I let the bank take your home, I would be killing her all over again. He slumped against the porch railing, the energy draining out of him, leaving him a hollow shell. I didn't give you the dress for a wedding, Clara. I gave it to you because it deserved to be worn by someone who was fighting to live. I gave it to you because I was tired of hoarding a ghost. The confession ended not with a bang, but with the quiet hiss of the rain. Clara stood there, the water mingling with the tears on her cheeks. The monster had vanished. replaced by a man crushed under the weight of a 20-year-old coin. She understood now. The anger, the coldness, the ledger. It wasn't greed. It was penance. He was punishing the world because he couldn't stop punishing himself. And the white dress, the scandal of the town, was nothing more than a father's final, desperate apology to a child who could no longer hear him. Mr. Thorne did not handle rejection with the grace of a gentleman. He handled it with the calculated malice of a cornered rat that realizes the trap is closing in. The banker sat in the dim back room of the livery stable, a place that smelt of wet hay and horse sweat, a far cry from the mahogany and velvet of his office. Across from him stood three men who looked as if they had been carved out of Badlands granite, their coats dusted with the grime of the road and their eyes empty of anything resembling mercy. They were not citizens of Oakhaven. They were tools, hammers looking for a nail, and Thorne was more than willing to point them toward the wood. He didn't want murder, not explicitly, for murder brought marshals and inquiries that disrupted business. But he wanted fear. He wanted the kind of terror that seeps into the groundwater and poisons the well. "The widow doesn't need to be heard," Thorne said, his voice low, competing with the sound of the rain that had finally tapered off into a sullen drizzle. "But the ranch needs to become untenable. A barn fire, a stampede, an accident of nature that just happens to be helped along by a match. Make her understand that the land is cursed. Make her beg to sell." He slid a heavy envelope across the barrel that served as a table. The leader of the trio, a man with a scar slicing through his left eyebrow, waved the envelope in his hand, grinning a grin that showed too many teeth. They didn't ask questions. Men like that never did. They simply pocketed the coin, mounted their horses, and rode out toward the valley bottom where the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and bruise. Thorne watched them go, adjusting his cuffs, convinced that the ledger would balance itself by morning. He had underestimated the widow's resolve. Yes, but he had severely miscalculated the volatility of the man who had come to her aid. He thought Silas Vance was a fossil, a man whose only weapon was a fountain pen. He forgot that before ink, there was lead. Down in the valley, peace was a fragile thing. Clara had returned to her chores, the emotional exhaustion of the afternoon weighing on her limbs like wet wool. The white dress had been carefully folded and placed back in its paper, a sacred relic now. But the reality of the ranch demanded her attention. The cattle were restless, lowing softly in the twilight, sensing the change in the air before the human senses could catch up. It started with a sound that didn't belong, the snap of a dry branch, the strike of a match against a boot heel. Then came the smell, kerosene, sharp, chemical, and terrifyingly out of place in the clean scent of the damp earth. Clara stepped out of her cabin, wiping her hands on her apron, her eyes scanning the darkening perimeter. A flicker of light caught her eye near the barn, a spark that bloomed impossibly fast into a tongue of orange flame. Panic, cold and electric, shot through her. "No," she whispered, the word lost in the sudden roar as the fire caught the dry hay stored in the loft. The barn didn't just burn, it exploded into light. The flames licked up the wooden sides, hungry and violent, casting long, dancing shadows that twisted like demons across the yard. The cattle in the adjacent pen screamed, the sound primal and terrified. As the heat washed over them, Clara ran toward the barn, grabbing a bucket of water from the trough. A futile, desperate gesture against an inferno. She saw the riders then, silhouettes against the firelight, hooting and hollering as they cut the fence wires, driving the panicked herd out into the night, scattering the only wealth she had left to the four winds. They weren't trying to put the fire out. They were celebrating it. She dropped the bucket, the water splashing uselessly into the mud, and realized with a sinking heart that this wasn't bad luck. This was war, miles away. On the high porch of the Vance Manor, Silas sat in his rocking chair. He wasn't rocking. He was staring. The rain had stopped, leaving the air clear and sharp, and the view of the valley was unobstructed. He saw the light first, a pinprick of orange in the sea of blue twilight. He watched it grow, pulsing and expanding until a pillar of black smoke began to rise, blotting out the first stars. He knew that fire. He had seen fires like that in the mining camps. Fires set to cover crimes. Fires set to drive out competition. He knew exactly where it was. Clara's place. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He didn't need to guess who lit the match. Thorne's threat echoed in his mind. "I'll give you a week to reconsider." The banker hadn't waited a week. He hadn't even waited a day. He had struck while the iron was hot. Assuming Silas was back in his manor, buried in his books, safe behind his walls, Silas looked at the fire, and then he looked at his hands. For 20 years, these hands had only held paper. They had held contracts, deeds, foreclosure notices. They had been clean. But as he watched the smoke curl into the shape of a question mark against the sky, the miser began to shed his skin. The coldness that had defined him melted away, replaced by a heat that had been dormant since Boreas Pass. He stood up, kicking the chair back so hard it toppled over. He didn't go to his safe. He didn't go to his desk. He walked into the hallway, past the portrait of his late wife, past the empty room that should have been Emily's, and stopped before a locked glass cabinet in the corner. He pulled a key from his watch chain, his finger steady, precise. The lock clicked. The door swung open. Inside, resting on velvet mounts, was a Winchester 1873 lever-action rifle. It wasn't a decorative piece. The stock was scratched, the bluing on the barrel worn silver in places. It was a tool he had used to guard supply wagons in a lawless land. He reached in and wrapped his hand around the cold steel. It felt heavy, substantial, a way that balanced the lightness in his soul. He grabbed a box of ammunition from the shelf, the brass cartridges clinking together like coins. But these were coins that bought a different kind of justice. He loaded the rifle as he walked to the door, the mechanical clack-clack of the lever action punctuating his steps. He wasn't Silas Vance the banker anymore. He wasn't the man with the ledger. He was the father who had failed to save his daughter from a fever. But by God, he would not fail to save this woman from the fire. He strode out to the stables, not waiting for the groom, and saddled his black gelding with a speed that defied his age. He swung into the saddle, the rifle scabbarded at his side, and dug his spurs in. The horse bolted forward, thundering down the driveway, whoosh tearing up the gravel. Silas leaned low over the neck, his eyes fixed on the burning horizon. The rhythmic acceleration of the gallop matched the pounding of his heart. He was riding into the flames, not to negotiate, not to buy, but to fight. The reluctance was gone. The hero, buried under 2 decades of grief and gold, had finally dug himself out of the grave, and he was bringing hell with him. The hoofbeats of Silas's black gelding drummed against the frozen earth like the heartbeat of a man waking from a long coma, rhythmic, desperate, and thundering with a violence that shattered the stillness of the valley night. He didn't feel the biting wind on his face or the ache in his aged joints. He only felt the heat of the fire that was consuming Clara's barn and threatening to leap, like a hungry beast, to the small cabin where she stood defenseless. As he crested the final ridge, the scene unfolded below him with a terrifying clarity, a tableau of innocence besieged by brutality. The snow, usually so pure and silencing, was illuminated by the chaotic orange glow of destruction, turning the drifts into pools of blood-red light. 3 men moved through the yard with the casual arrogance of predators who knew their prey had no teeth. They were laughing, a sound that carried over the roar of the flames, tossing torches toward the porch where Clara stood, clutching a shovel like a weapon of war, her silhouette small and trembling against the inferno. She wasn't screaming. She was silent, a statue of defiance in the face of inevitable ruin. Silas didn't shout a warning. He didn't call out for them to stop. He simply raised the Winchester. The stock pulled against his cheek, and let the rifle speak for him. The first shot cracked through the air, kicking hard against his shoulder, and sent a spray of splinters flying from the post inches from the lead rider's head. The laughter died instantly. The men spun around, their hands flying to their holsters. confusion replacing their cruelty. They had expected a weeping woman, perhaps a shouting neighbor, but they had not expected the angel of death riding down from the hill. Silas levered the rifle, the metallic clack-clack barely audible over the fire, and fired again. He wasn't a marksman. He wasn't a lawman. He was a banker who hadn't fired a gun in anger since the supply trails of '64, and his aim was wide, the bullet tearing through the flank of the horse rather than its rider. The animal reared, screaming, throwing the man into the mud. Chaos erupted. The other two men returned fire, their muzzle flashes blooming like evil flowers in the dark. Bullets whined past Silas, snapping through the air like angry hornets. But he didn't stop. He kept riding, closing the distance, offering himself as a target to draw the fire away from the porch. He was trading his life for hers, a transaction he made without a second thought, finally spending his existence on something that mattered. The yard became a blur of noise and heat. Silas pulled the horse up hard, sliding in the slush, and leveled the rifle again. "Get out," he roared, his voice raw and unrecognizable. Tearing from his throat with the force of 20 years of silence, a bullet struck the saddle horn, sending leather fragments into the air. Another kicked up mud into his eyes. He fired back, wildly, blindly, driven by a sheer, unadulterated will to protect the woman who wore his daughter's dress. And then, it happened. A sharp, searing impact slammed into his left shoulder, spinning him halfway around in the saddle. It felt like being struck by a sledgehammer heated in a forge. The rifle slipped from his numb fingers, clattering to the ground. The world tilted gray and fuzzy at the edges. He slumped forward, clutching the mane of his horse, the breath driven from his lungs. But he didn't fall. He glared through the pain, through the smoke, locking eyes with the man on the ground who was taking aim for the kill shot. The hired hand hesitated. He looked at the old man, bleeding, unarmed, yet sitting on his horse with the terrifying resolve of a biblical judge. He looked at the fire reflecting in Silas's eyes, and he saw something that scared him more than a marshal's badge. He saw a man who was already dead and didn't care. The nerve of the attackers broke. They weren't paid enough to fight a ghost. With shouts of panic, they scrambled for their mounts, wheeling around and spurring their horses into the darkness, leaving the fire and the ruin behind them. Silas watched them go, the adrenaline fading, leaving only the cold and the agony. He tried to dismount, but his legs refused to obey. He slid from the saddle, hitting the ground with a heavy, wet thud, the mud instantly soaking his coat. He lay there, staring up at the smoke swirling across the stars, his hand pressed to his shoulder, the blood seeping hot and sticky between his fingers. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was broken by the sound of frantic footsteps running across the yard. "Silas." Clara's voice was a sob, a prayer. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his wound, terrified to touch him. The white dress, or what was left of it, was stained with soot and mud, ruined beyond repair. But Silas had never seen anything more beautiful. "You came," she whispered, wiping the dirt from his face with her shawl. "You came back." Silas tried to speak, to tell her that the ledger was balanced, that the debt was paid, but his voice failed him. He only managed a weak nod, his eyes drifting shut. And then, the sound of many horses approaching filled the air. The townspeople, they had seen the fire, they had heard the shots, the sheriff, the bartender, the men from the saloon who had mocked him only nights before. They all rode into the yard, guns drawn, expecting to find bandits or tragedy. Instead, they pulled up their horses in a stunned circle. The firelight flickered over the scene, illuminating the charred barn, the weeping widow, and the man they called a miser, a monster, a heart of stone, lying in the freezing mud, bleeding out to save a patch of land that wasn't his. The contrast was absolute, the violence of the gunshot wound against the innocence of the snow, the ruin of the barn against the survival of the home, the jagged, ugly past of Silas Vance colliding with the beautiful. sacrificial present. The sheriff swung down from his horse, taking his hat off slowly, a gesture of respect he had never thought he would offer to the banker. "Get the doctor," he shouted, his voice breaking the spell. "Ride like hell and get the doctor." As hands reached down to lift him, Silas felt a strange warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the fever of the wound. For the first time in his life, he wasn't holding on to gold. He was being held by the hands of the people he thought hated him. And he realized, as the darkness took him, that he was finally, truly, poor in coin, but rich in something far more dangerous. He had brought his soul back. The fever that had raged through Silas Vance, burning almost as hot as the barn fire, finally broke on the morning of the fourth day. When he opened his eyes, the ceiling of his bedroom didn't look like the lid of a coffin anymore. It looked simply like plaster catching the soft, golden light of a dawn that promised a thaw. The silence of the manor had changed too. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive quiet of a tomb, but the restful hush of a place that was healing. He tried to sit up, a sharp gasp escaping his lips as the bandages on his shoulder pulled tight, a reminder of the lead he had taken for a woman he barely knew. But he wasn't alone. A hand, rough with work but gentle in touch, steadied him. Clara sat in the chair beside the bed, her eyes shadowed with fatigue but clear with a gratitude that needed no words. She didn't speak of the dead. She didn't speak of the interest rates. Those things had burned up in the fire along with the hay. Instead, she spoke of the town. She told him in a soft murmur that the sheriff had come for Mr. Thorne before the smoke had even cleared from the valley floor. The banker hadn't gone quietly, blustering about property rights and connections. But the sight of 3 hired guns confessing to arson in exchange for a lighter noose had silenced him quickly enough. Thorne was gone, taken to the county seat in irons, his ambition ending not in a kingdom of water rights, but in a cold iron cell. The town, Clara whispered, was confused. They didn't know what to make of a villain who bled like a hero. The saloon was quiet. The men who had wagered on Silas's wickedness were now sheepishly leaving jars of broth and bundles of firewood at the manor gates, offerings of apology to a man they had misjudged for 20 years. Silas listened, his gaze fixed on the window where the snow was finally beginning to melt, dripping from the eaves like tears of relief. It mattered, and yet it didn't. The opinion of the sheep meant little to the shepherd, but the presence of the woman beside him meant everything. Clara hesitated then, her hands moving to a bundle of cloth resting on the nightstand. It was wrapped in the same brown paper he had given her, but it looked smaller now, sadder. She pulled it open slowly, revealing the white silk. It was a ruin. The ham was caked with the black mud of the barnyard. The delicate lace of the bodice was gray with soot, and there was a tear near the sleeve where she had snagged it on a fence post while fighting the fire. She ran her hand over the stains, her expression pained. "I ruined it," she said, her voice thick with regret. "You gave me something perfect, something priceless, and I dragged it through the dirt. I wanted to look like a lady, Silas, but I ended up looking like a field hand." She looked down, unable to meet his eyes. "I'm so sorry. It was Emily's dress, and I destroyed it." The room went silent again, the clock on the mantel ticking away the seconds. Silas looked at the dress. He remembered the day he bought it, the pristine, blinding whiteness of it in the shop window, a symbol of a perfection he could never achieve in a life he couldn't save. He remembered how it had sat in the dark for 2 decades, untouched, unsoiled, and completely useless. It had been a prisoner of his grief, kept pure only because it was kept dead. He looked at the stains now. He saw the mud from the land he had helped save. He saw the soot from the fire that hadn't consumed her home. He saw the tear from the struggle to survive. The dress wasn't ruined. For the first time, it was real. He reached out, his hand shaking slightly, and covered hers where it rested on the silk. "No," he rasped, his voice stronger than it had been in years. "You didn't ruin it, Clara. You finished it." She looked up, confused. Silas smiled, a genuine, weary smile that cracked the stone mask of his face wide open. For 20 years, that dress was a shroud. It was waiting for a ghost. It was clean because it had no life in it. It was perfect because it was empty. He squeezed her hand. You took it out of the dark. You wore it to fight for your home. You wore it to stand in front of a fire and refuse to burn. That mud, that's it. That's not dirt, Clara. That's life. That's the mark of a woman who stood her ground. He leaned back against the pillows, his chest heaving slightly with the effort of speaking, but his eyes shining with a peace he hadn't known since before the fever took Emily. A dress like that, it wasn't made to stay white in a box. It was made to be worn. It was made to be lived in. You used it to save a life, instead of just mourning one. Emily, she would have hated the box, but she would have loved the fight. Tears spilled over Clara's lashes, hot and fast, but she didn't look away. She nodded, clutching the stained silk to her chest not as a ruined treasure, but as a battle flag. The ledger in Silas's head, the one that had been in the red for so long, finally, quietly, clicked into balance. The cost of the dress had been $500 and 20 years of sorrow, but the value of it, stained and torn in the hands of a survivor, was beyond measure. The miser was dead, buried in the mud of Willow Creek. The man who remained lay in the bed, wounded but whole, watching the sunlight reclaim the room, knowing that some stains didn't spoil the fabric. They just proved that the person wearing it was alive enough to get dirty. Spring swept through the territory with the force of a Parton, washing away the gray sense of winter and leaving behind a world painted in vibrant, hopeful greens. The creek, once a frozen ribbon of silence, now roared with the meltwater, a sound that was no longer a threat of flood but a promise of life. Silas Vance rode down the winding trail from his manor, his black gelding stepping high through the wildflowers that had erupted from the mud of the battlefield. He didn't ride with the hunched, hurried posture of a dead collector anymore. He sat tall, his left shoulder stiff but functional, the physical scar a small price for the lightness in his chest. When he arrived at Clara's ranch, the smell of charred wood was gone, replaced by the scent of fresh pine lumber and wet earth. The barn was rising again, framed by neighbors who had come with hammers instead of judgment. But it was Silas who had brought the foundation. He found Clara on the porch, the very place where the hired guns had tried to burn her out. She wasn't holding a shovel today. She was holding 2 cups of coffee, steam rising into the crisp morning air. She watched him dismount, her eyes crinkling at the corners, the fear that had defined their first meeting replaced by a quiet, enduring peace. Silas climbed the steps, the wood solid under his boots, and reached into his coat pocket. He didn't pull out a ledger. He didn't pull out a demand. He pulled out a single, folded piece of heavy parchment, the promissory note, the document that gave him the right to take everything she had. He held it out to her, his hand steady. Clara hesitated, her fingers brushing the paper. "The balance is 0, she whispered, quoting the bank clerk. Silas shook his head slowly. "The balance is irrelevant," he corrected, his voice a low rumble that harmonized with the rushing creek. "Some things can't be counted. They can only be released." He struck a match on the porch railing, the flame flaring bright and sudden, and held it to the corner of the document. They watched in silence as the fire curled the paper, turning the legalese and the numbers into fragile black ash that floated away on the gentle breeze. It was a different kind of fire than the one that had raged weeks ago. That fire had been meant to destroy, to take, to consume. This fire was a cleansing, a final, sacred act of liberation that freed them both. The paper disappeared, and with it, the last tether of the old Silas Vance. He wasn't the banker who owned her land. He was the neighbor who had saved it. They sat on the porch steps as the morning deepened, not speaking, because there was nothing left to say. The town gossips might have looked for a romance, for a wedding to tie the story up with an eboo. But what Silas and Clara shared was something far rarer and more durable than a courtship. They were 2 soldiers who had survived the same war. They were 2 broken people who would use their jagged edges to fit together and build something whole. Silas looked out over the valley, his eyes finally seeing the beauty his money had never been able to buy. He thought of Emily, not with the crushing weight of the stone in his chest, but with a soft, melancholic sweetness. The white dress had done its work. It had bridged the gap between the living and the dead, and in doing so, it had allowed the father to finally forgive himself. He took a sip of the coffee, the bitterness pleasant on his tongue, and realized he was no longer cold. The frost that had encased his heart for 20 years had finally, fully melted. And so, we leave them there, watching the light chase the shadows out of the canyon. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? We spent so much of our lives filling ledgers, counting coins, building walls to keep the world out and our treasures in. We convince ourselves that safety is found in the numbers, that worth is found in what we can hold in our hands. But looking at Silas Vance, a man who had a fortune in the bank but died 1,000 deaths in a lonely house, you have to ask yourself, what is the true cost of redemption? Is it measured in the gold we hoard, or in the debts we forgive? Is a man rich because of what he keeps, or is he rich because of what he is willing to lose to save another? Silas Vance gave away his money, his reputation, and nearly his life. And in return, he got the only thing that really matters. He got a morning where he could breathe without hurting. He got a friend. And as the sun crested the mountains, painting the healed land in a glorious, blinding gold that no miner could ever dig from the earth, we are reminded that the most valuable things in this life are the ones that come without a price tag. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.